to Florence today, if you're tuning in for the sixth episode of my online art history talks. Today we're going to be looking at two beautiful pictures by the Italian Renaissance artist Botticelli. The image that you can see on the screen here is the incredibly famous Primavera painting, which is in the Uffizi Museum in Florence. And we're also going to be taking a look at the Birth of Venus. The pictures have been together for nearly 500 years. They don't come from the same year, but certainly they have been in the museum in Florence for more than 200 years. So let's make a start and see how we get along with this. Everybody, Botticelli is born in Florence. He spends actually the majority of his life in the city. He goes to Pisa once, and when he's a little bit older, around 30 or so, he goes to Rome as well. He paints in the Sistine Chapel, on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. That's eclipsed, of course, by what Michelangelo does later. But Botticelli's a little bit older. He's from a slightly different generation than Michelangelo. For example, Botticelli dies in the year 1510, and that's the year that Michelangelo is halfway through painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So he's a bit older. But what we're looking at here is one of his most famous pictures. This is the Adoration of the Magi. This picture was painted in 1475, and it is a beautiful image with obviously fantastic rich colours. It is the three wise men coming to see the baby Jesus, held obviously by the Virgin Mary, and there's Joseph looking a bit bored actually above them. But there are some very prominent local citizens in this painting. It was very common during the Renaissance period for a wealthy patron to commission a painting of some aspect of from the Bible or the life of the Holy Family, and have their relatives or themselves painted in the picture. And this would make them look incredibly important in the eyes of ordinary people, who would presume, because what they're looking at is so incredibly realistic, that these wealthy citizens are incredibly important and famous. So in this scenario, it's quite common to have the artist actually paint himself, and that's precisely what we have here. So this is Botticelli standing over on the right looking at us. There are a couple of other people in the painting looking at us, not least the chap, the financier who's had this picture commissioned. He is right here. And then there are several prominent members of the Medici family. This painting, everybody started its life in the beautiful church of Santa Maria Novella, which is over on the western side of Florence. And then it's in the Uffizi Museum today. So let's have a look at the local citizens of Florence. It's mostly, of course, the Medici family. So here, this is Cosimo de' Medici. He's very important. He's regarded, still is in some ways, as the sort of grandfather, the grand patron of the city. He's the man who rapidly expanded the wealth and scope of the Medici Bank, which had branches all over Europe at one point, even in London. So he's extremely wealthy. He's also, crucially, he's a patron of the arts. So he's funding or encouraging artists really like never before. So that's, I suppose, he's a big reason why Florence becomes a real centre for the rebirth of classical ideas. So his influence cannot be really underestimated. And then there are other members of the Medici family down here. This is Piero, his son, his nickname Piero the Gouty. He takes over only for a few years, I think 5 or 6 years. This is his brother right here. This is another Medici here. And then art historians think this figure here is Lorenzo de' Medici, although some art historians say this figure. So there's always sort of debate with Botticelli because he's not particularly well documented. But we can see that the picture is in great condition. It's definitely one of his most famous paintings. And it's for that reason that I've included it in the discussion of the two more famous paintings. But obviously the artists were generally working on religious paintings. But this one gives us an idea of incredibly how skillful Botticelli was. Here's an image of him. His actual name was Alessandro Filippetti, but he gets the nickname Botticelli, which means little barrel. So one would presume then that he's quite short in stature, although we don't get the sense of that from this painting. Everybody, this is the Primavera painting, and it comes, the year is about 1482, and he comes back from Rome. He's just finished painting 3 different panels, in fact, in the Sistine Chapel. And so, of course, he's pretty well known, highly regarded. And Lorenzo de' Medici, who's the ruler of Florence, has been planning a wedding for a nephew of his for a while due to a problem that's occurred a couple of years before. So a bit of background quickly on this. The Medici family are the rulers of Florence, the de facto rulers. It's supposed to be a sort of council of rulers, but because of their wealth, they're a wealthy banking family who've got branches of their bank all over Italy. Italy is not a unified country at this point, so each city is its own individual city-state. However, their banks are all in different parts of the territory, and they also have got foreign branches in foreign countries too. So they're very, very wealthy. So what happens is that another family which has a plot against Lorenzo. It's called the Pazzi conspiracy. The Pazzi family in 1478 attack Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano in the middle of a cathedral service. So they're in the Cathedral of Florence, and they're attacked. The conspirators are round up and summarily executed. The problem, though, is the Pope in Rome, Sixtus IV, is implicated in helping out the conspirators. So he takes a very dim view of actually a cardinal has been involved in this plot. The cardinal is killed along with his co-conspirators. Pope takes a really dim view. And Lorenzo de' Medici is excommunicated from the church, which back then was a really big deal. He's got to find a way of redressing the balance here to avoid Rome making arrangements with other cities to attack Florence. So that's a real problem for him. So what does he do? He arranges for one of his younger family members. He's not even an adult yet. He's still a child. Probably about 17 at the time, I think. For a wedding with a girl from a prominent family from the south of Italy. And her name is Semiramis Appiani. And that family is very close with a very powerful family in Naples, Napoli in the south of Italy, and they're the Aragonese, and they are close to the Pope. So in other words, it's a very carefully calibrated political movement that Lorenzo is making, and so his preparations are in depth and precise, and this painting forms part of his preparations. So in one sense, it's a marriage painting. And in another sense, of course, there are obvious allusions to certain classical texts. So let's look at the painting in two different ways. First of all, over on the left, we've got the figure of Mercury who's got winged heels. And He's got like a herald's wand in his hand, and what he's doing here, he's trying to break the clouds up. So in other words, this means therefore it's the advent of spring. Over here are the three graces. The three graces, we know that because of their beautiful clothing. And of course, from a classical text, we'd have to look at the Roman poet Seneca. His poem De Beneficis describes the clothes that these women are wearing. The classical text that we can look at with regard to Mercury would be Virgil's Aeneid. He talks about Mercury dividing the winds and the clouds. We move over to the middle of the picture, and this is Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, but also in this context, she's going to be another function of the goddess would be of marriage. Then above her head, we've got what looks like Eros, who's about to fire an arrow at one of the graces. Then over to the right of the painting, we've got a slightly more dynamic series of events happening. We've got Zephyrus, who's the god of the west wind, and he's flying through the forest and grabs the forest nymph called Chloris, and as soon as he grabs her, roses start coming out of her mouth that you can see. And we'll get a close-up of this in a second. And she metamorphizes into the goddess of spring, Flora. And this story is told in a poem by Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid, and that poem is called Fasti. So in other words, there are various different classical texts that probably what's happened is that Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, has surrounded himself by some quite brilliant individuals who have read many of the ancient texts. They're studying architecture, they're studying poetry, they're studying painting, all sorts of things. So Angelo Poliziano and Pico della Mirandola are examples of these brilliant people who are probably advising the painter. It's possible that Botticelli had read some of this material himself, but nevertheless, these are there's this kind of society of intellectuals that are looking at Neoplatonic ideas, intellectual ideas, and we know this because, for example, Michelangelo, the sculptor, ends up living in the Medici Palace and is taught directly by these people too. Now we can see they're set in a beautiful orchard here, and it's orange trees, and orange trees are a symbol for the Medici and always were. And we can see dozens, maybe hundreds of flowers all over the floor. Now, quite often you look at a picture like this and you think, if only you could see the painting when it was painted brand new, because a lot of the colour has faded a little bit. The main figures, I suppose, are okay. And this figure here of Flora is particularly beautiful. Her dress is astonishing in its complexity. But many of the green colours have probably darkened out a bit, and only we could see the picture when it was first painted. There are dozens of different flower species and plant species in the painting. I think people who know more about this have put together something like 46 different plant species, and about the same for flowers, so it's an incredible composition. This is what the painting looks like today in the Uffizi Museum, and it's probably down to the new German director, Eike Schmidt, who initially his appointment was quite contentious, but he's really done a quite brilliant job of lighting the painting so nicely. So what we can see here is you're now encouraged to walk right up. This is non-reflective perspex, which means that you can't really see that there's a layer of protection there. And the way the painting used to be hung before he arrived in Florence was like this. So here's the birth of Venus, and this is him actually walking through the empty gallery. And certainly when the gallery was full, you'd almost always have a member of staff here, and they were really stopping people moving beyond about this point. So you couldn't really ever get close, and the pictures weren't lit particularly well. But there's been a big change, and so many of the most famous paintings in the gallery have now received this wonderful new treatment with excellent lighting and presentation. So I think he's done a great job, this new director. Here is an image of, this is a Botticelli picture, and it's likely, although we know so little about him. The problem there is because his first biographer, Giorgio Vasari, who's an artist himself, has written a pretty brief biography of him, and it's also not completely complimentary. So his works are not precisely documented, certainly not in terms of dates. So historians have got to cobble together the order of how and where, of course, his paintings are. But this image is thought to be Lorenzo de' Medici when he was a young man, and he's holding here an image of his grandfather, Cosimo de' Medici. So Lorenzo de' Medici looked a bit strange. He had a slightly unappealing face. He had a huge hooked nose, and I don't think this painting reflects that, but it's likely that this is Lorenzo de' Medici. Here is a great close-up of the dress that I talked about. So look at the way that this beautiful gold is painted on the sleeves and all the different flowers. The roses, of course, here is Flora. She's throwing roses. And roses were always used to signify marriage, weddings, and that sort of thing. And we can see here the roses coming out of Chloris's mouth as she metamorphizes into Flora. This is a close-up of Venus, and the reason for showing this to you is because Venus is wearing a pendant of a crescent moon, and this would have symbolized chastity, which seems strange to be talking about chastity for a wedding. The church was very strict on these sorts of issues and woe betide anybody that had sex for anything other than procreation. So girls and the women were taught to behave in a very dignified fashion. They were all very well educated. I suppose that's one advantage. But the marriage itself could be a pretty debilitating experience for a woman in 15th, 16th century Florence, for sure. I went to the Uffizi Museum a few years ago, but in the wintertime when there are fewer tourists around. And it was the first time that the painting had been lit in this wonderful new way. And so the colours are, certainly from the clothing point of view, and the flowers, very vibrant. So I was able to get some nice close-ups of these. And it's clear that the painter would have taken hours over each individual plant and flower here. So look at a couple of these close-ups. We can see there are dozens of different plant species here, and actually the detail on this is fabulous. And this, of course, is eye level because the picture's like quite high up. By the way, the dimensions of this it's 6.5 feet tall and about 10.5 feet across, so it's a massive image, and it's clearly not designed for a church. It's designed for the walls of a palace, and that's exactly where it was its whole life. I think this might be an iris. If anyone can perhaps leave a comment. Summary of this painting, everybody. I've talked before, perhaps on a couple of occasions, of the huge advantages that we have in the 21st century with the visual experience of being able to watch the television, going to the cinema, foreign travel, internet, looking at magazines, meaning that in comparison to somebody that lived 500 years ago, that didn't have any of those things and probably lived in a field in a hut, to think what it would have been like for someone like that to have seen a picture like this would have been an overwhelming visual experience. It's hugely impressive now, and when I take small groups of people into the Uffizi to see this, it's the only painting anywhere in the world, I think, where I take people to, where people will just walk up to the painting as close as they can get. And because of the beautiful new lighting, everyone wants to look at the close-up details of the flowers and that sort of thing. And in that sense, it doesn't need any explanation. It is absolutely beautiful to look at, even if you know nothing about the background of the painting. And in that sense, we can have this debate. To my way of thinking, it certainly is the most beautiful painting I've ever seen. And I always hugely look forward to seeing it again. And that's not just... There are lots of people who think this too. That's probably why the picture's so famous. What an incredible marriage gift to receive. Absolutely unbelievable. The Birth of Venus is obviously an incredibly famous image. It comes from a little later. This is 1486. And the image is so famous, of course, that it acts as a sort of marketing point for the museum. So there are many books with this famous image on the cover of this beautiful face of Venus. The painting has been in the museum since 1815. It's probably also for the same patron. So Lorenzo de' Medici has almost certainly commissioned this. It's not likely that anybody else in Florence would have commissioned a work of a naked woman. It's a non-religious subject again, of course, so we're talking something very different from what artists of the day were doing. They were paid money for producing works of art that were in churches and this kind of thing, and suppose quite good money for it. But this is something not seen since the times of antiquity, so it's completely different. But it would have been, for anyone lucky enough to have seen it, a truly fabulous experience. So Botticelli was often criticised by his contemporaries, not least by Leonardo da Vinci, for a less than realistic view of the human body and also of landscape. So, for example, the perspective lessons that artists had learnt have essentially almost been ignored here. And also the bodies look a little different to what other artists, his contemporaries, were doing. We don't have to look too closely to see that Venus has got a hugely elongated neck. Her left shoulder sits at an unusual, let's just say, angle. The left arm is really much too long. And also she's standing at an angle where you'd almost certainly be falling over if you stood like that. Rather than the birth of Venus, the picture perhaps ought to be called instead the arrival on the island of Cyprus of the goddess Venus. And so we know this from certain passages in ancient poetry. There's a writer called Hesiod, in his poem Theogony. Venus steps on the land and instantly the flowers and flora and fauna burst into bloom. And we do see some evidence of this, because down on the ground there are plants growing, whereas down here there aren't any. Again, we're in an orange grove. And here's evidence of the roses being blown into view as she lands on the seashore. And here, again, we have a familiar figure. This is Zephyrus, the god of the west wind. And he's entwined with one of his contemporaries, probably Hora, Hora, although it does look, again, a little bit like Chloris. They're flying together to blow her into shore. And this figure here is Horai, who's the goddess who envelops Venus in this fabulous cloak. There's a superb passage from one of the Homeric from Homer, hymn to Aphrodite. So I'm just going to quote this. Of August, gold-wreathed and beautiful Aphrodite I shall sing, to whose domain belong the battlements of all sea-laved Cyprus, where, blown by the moist breath of Zephyrus, she was carried over the waves of the resounding sea in soft foam. The gold-filleted Horai happily welcomed her and clothed her with heavenly raiment. Well, this should be enough to encourage anyone to read some ancient poetry. So we can see that Botticelli has probably been advised once again by Angelo Poliziano of these ancient texts. And it's pretty clear that what he's portrayed is pretty much exactly what we've just heard. But it is a beautiful image which looks a little different now from the image that you're looking at on this screen. In reality, the colour has faded quite a lot in the painting. The two pictures were together from about 1540 onwards, but we don't know where this picture started. We can only presume it was in the Medici Palace in Florence, and then it was transferred to their country home out at Castello, which is northwest of the city. And then from that point onwards, from about 1540, both the Primavera and the Birth of Venus were together. As I said already, both pictures, they end up in the museum of the Uffizi Museum 200 years ago. The Birth of Venus is a bit smaller than the Primavera, so it's 5.5 feet tall and 9 feet wide. It is supposedly, allegedly, this lady here is based upon a famous Florentine beautiful woman whose name is Simonetta Vespucci, but who was a girlfriend of... She was a girlfriend of the brother of the ruler of Florence, Giuliano Medici, who was killed. But this is improbable because she died about 10 years before the painting was painted. And there are lots of women that look like this in Botticelli's pictures, but it's undeniable that this is one of the, if not the most famously beautiful face in all of Western art. Everybody, this is an image of the Medici Venus, which would have been very well known to Botticelli during his life, and it would have been in the collection of Lorenzo de' Medici, most likely in the Medici Palace in Florence. What it is, of course, is quite close to what Botticelli has done in the Birth of Venus. We can see the obvious similarities. The sculpture itself is based very closely on a very famous ancient work of art which was lost and sculpted by the very famous ancient Greek sculptor Praxiteles. But this version of the sculpture was probably quite similar. So this is about 100 BC. Praxiteles would have been about 400 BC, I suppose. So this now, actually this sculpture is now in the Uffizi Museum in Florence, but it gives you an idea of the basis for the figure that Botticelli painted. Here's a beautiful close-up of the goddess Horai, and the reason for showing you this, of course, is to show you the cloak, which is beautifully decorated with, we can see daisies there. She's got myrtle around her neck, and she's also got roses down here. So again, once again, an obvious thing to say, if only you could have seen the painting when it was first painted, colours would have been incredibly vibrant and beautiful. Everybody, this concludes my talk on The Birth of Venus and Primavera by Botticelli, these two fabulous paintings. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and it goes without saying that I unequivocally recommend a trip to Florence in the future to go and see them. It would be hugely worthwhile. Okay, so next week we are going to be looking at a very famous painting in Paris, Le Moulin de la Galette by Renoir. So tune in next week. Thank you.